I'll introduce myself and I'll introduce our speaker today. But first of all, I would like to express gratitude to the Committee for Yiddish and the Workmen's Circle in Toronto, who are sponsoring this talk today and made it possible for us to have Chantal Ringuet as a speaker. My name is Anastasia Lupas. I'm a scholar of Yiddish literature as well, and I teach Yiddish classes here in Toronto for the Committee for Yiddish. And our speaker today is Chantal Ringuet. I apologize in advance if my French pronunciation is not perfect. Chantal is a Canadian award-winning author, scholar, and translator. Her work stands at the intersection of literature, translation, and the arts, with a focus on the archives. She has been a fellow at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research in New York, a scholar in residence at the Hadassah Brandeis Institute, and a writer in residence at the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. With Pierre Ancti, Chantal has translated Eygens by Marc Chagall from Yiddish into French. Chantal Ringuet is also a Leonard Cohen scholar. She co-edited the book Les Révolutions de Léonard Cohen, which received a 2017 Canadian Jewish Literary Award in Toronto. I welcome Chantal, and I'll just remind Sharon if we are recording the talk.
We are recording the talk. We are good to go.
Okay, excellent. So Chantal, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much. So I'll say a few words in Yiddish and then I will continue in English. A guten Abend, a schönen Dank Anastasia für deine Präsentation. Es ist ein großes Kaved zu sein da mit euch eint und reden wegen Marc Chagall und der jiddischen Kultur. Ich will danken der Komitee für Yiddish bei der Toronto Jiddischer Föderation und dem Arbeiterring für der Einladung. So, good evening, everybody. It is a great honor to be here with you tonight for this talk on Marc Chagall and Yiddish culture. Moishe Chagall was born in 1887 in Vitebsk, a small town in Belarus. As a young man, he went to Petersburg in order to study art with Yuri Pen. Later, he went to Paris, the city of lights, where he became famous under the name Marc Chagall. And he then became one of the most prominent European artists of the modern age. Tonight, I will speak about Chagall's true colors, an expression which refers to his own use of color in modern art, of course, but also to his authentic voice. As French translator of Eygens, Chagall's original autobiography, which was written in Yiddish, I would like to bring you inside his inner life, thoughts, and dreams. His paintings and his use of color in particular provide a direct access to his emotional life. This is why I will introduce you inside Chagall's colors in relationship to his text. As much as the colors are unique, his voice in Yiddish is original, ironic, and oneiric. So I will discuss his work as a painter whose art illustrates, as in Benjamin Fondan's words, a Yiddish paradise. In this case, we're talking about Chagall's Mameloshen, his mother tongue, his own culture, and his life as a young boy living in a traditional Shtetl, or small town in Eastern Europe, who later made his way all throughout Europe, first in Petersburg, and then in Paris, Moscow, Berlin, and then Paris again. So during my talk, I will put the emphasis on what I would call the narrative tension between the two cities, Vitebsk and Paris. Vitebsk, his hometown that he left when he was a young adult, and Paris, where he arrives as an immigrant and where he will become an artist from, to a certain point, from the Western world. Vitebsk figures in most of the works that he did in France, and although he had left it, it became a major source of his inspiration. So first I will mostly present a gallery of paintings because I really want you to be immersed in Chagall's artworks. And then I will go deeper into the subject of his Yiddish autobiography. On the first slide, so the first image that you can see, the first image, so the previous one. Can we go back? Yes, thank you. Here is the Place de la Concorde. This is a lithography from the series Regard sur Paris. Over the Moon, the title of my presentation is inspired by this beautiful red moon. And I chose it because it's a later painting. It was part of a series dating from 1963, which confirms his affection for Paris and the importance of the city is in imaginary life. In this painting, you can notice the stunning use of colors that depict a dreamlike subject, in this case, the City of Lights. The weightless characters and the deconstruction of perspective, all these elements are characteristics, as we know, of Chagall's paintings from his early beginnings until his later works. Now we will move slowly to the next image. Thank you. So what is Chagall's approach of artistic creation? I would like to start with this question. First, I will quote Benjamin Fondan. I will introduce you to Benjamin Fondan later in my talk, but let's say for now that he was a contemporary of Chagall, and he was also a very important artist and writer in Paris at the same period. So in an essay that he wrote about Chagall, Fondan said, "This man, by his sole presence, by his luminosity, his qualitative density, depreciates everything that we touch, all this old horrible earth. I tell you, is a no-go. We don't keep company with angels when we are very annoyed and when we don't know which way to turn in order to earn a living. These angels have something inhuman, even when they are doing paintings. We want to run away, we love them, we throw them on the ground and they don't even break. We kill them and they rise from the dead. In truth, I tell you, they bring us more despair than joy." So here you have a couple of reflections on Chagall from Benjamin Fondan. And Chagall's art is polyphonic. It combines several formal concerns associated with modernist trends and a diversity of cultural representations like Jewish or Christian iconography, as well as an interest in the fantastic and the grotesque. His poetic and figurative style has been described as a hybrid of cubism, fauvism, and symbolism, and his supernatural subjects are thought to have significantly influenced the surrealists. His distinct style and his iconic imagery contributed highly to make him one of the most original and prominent artists of his time. Now, on the right, you can see a photo of Chagall that was taken in 1920 by Pierre Schumann. And on the left, a beautiful quote from Chagall, who used to say, "If I create from the heart, nearly everything works. If from the head, almost nothing." So this quote expresses his intuitive approach of painting, as opposed to the formalist approach of academic art that he was confronted with in Russia. In the flying carriage that you can see in the middle, the red is absolutely stunning. At the time, it was considered quite a bold move to use color this way. It was actually in complete rupture with forms of art which were deemed to be aesthetic and appropriate. And in fact, this painting, as well as a few others depicting Vitebsk, give us such a great sense of the place, where simple elements of daily life become magical, as if they were seen through the eyes of a child, very important in the case of Chagall, because that's why Chagall's fantastic imagery makes one feel bewitched. Here, as in many artworks from his younger years, you can find the expression of mischievousness and lyricism. So we will move to the next images. Thank you. Where does Chagall come from? When I first read Chagall's autobiography, entitled in French Ma Vie, which was the first official version published in 1931, and still that has been edited many times since then, we could read in the first pages of the book that it was translated from Russian by Bella Chagall, who used to be Marc Chagall's first wife. So I thought that he had first written it in Russian, and like many people a long time ago, I thought that Chagall was Russian, mostly. Well, he was, but he was not only Russian. So Chagall comes from Vitebsk, and here you have two images of Vitebsk. The first one was a photograph dating from around 1900 from the main in Vitebsk. And on the right side, you can see a painting of the marketplace that Chagall did in his early period. At the time, Vitebsk was a small provincial town where you could find beautiful religious buildings, mostly Orthodox churches. There were many cottage industries which hired tailors. There were also a lot of merchants who served as intermediaries between peasants and the companies exporting agricultural products. A very important element to note is that at that time, 60% of Vitebsk's population was Jewish. So it was actually a Shtetl, a small town from Eastern European with a very important Jewish population, which belonged mostly to the lower classes. Now, in order to give you a global idea of Chagall's trajectory in Europe during his youth, I would like to quickly remind you the different stages in his life that are included in his first original autobiography that he wrote in 1922-23 at age 35. Until the age of 20, he spent his life in the small provincial town of Vitebsk. And by the way, this was also Bella Chagall's place of birth. So his first wife, whose original name was not Bella Chagall, it was rather Bertha Rosenberg. In 1907, He went to St. Petersburg, where he stayed for 3 years, studying art in the academic environment of the Russian Empire with Professor Bakst. At some point, he became disillusioned with with the Russian artistic environment, which he found very academic. One day in 1910, he decided to go to Paris by train. He was attracted by the extraordinary cultural milieu of the Ville Lumière, and there he met most of the luminaries of that period. His very prolific stay was abruptly ended in 1914 with the outbreak of World War I, and then he was forced to go back to Russia, where he stayed to witness the Russian Revolution of October 1917. After a brief return to Vitebsk, he established himself in Moscow in 1911, where he became involved in with the Jewish theater of Moscow as a decorator. There he produced some of his most remarkable works. For example, a beautiful mural that we will see later in the slideshow. Later on, he spent some time in Berlin and then moved back again to Paris in 1923. He stayed there most of his life, except during the war years, where he moved to New York. And now I would like to introduce you to two important paintings of Chagall on the next slide, please. The first one, which is very well known, the Green Violinist, and the other one, Over Vitebsk, which show his attachment to the folklore and to his hometown. The Green Violinist is definitely one of the most famous paintings of Chagall. The fiddler is a perfect example of what is unique in his painting at the time. So the artist has a profound experience of life in the Shtetl, and that's what he is transposing here in his painting. The traditional Jewish life with small wooden buildings in the background and a violinist with a traditional dress and social function. The violin being, as you probably know, a typical musical instrument in the diaspora. At the same time, this is formally a very modern painting inspired, sorry, I was distracted. Inspired, yes, by Cubism with extremely bold colors and a collapse of perspective. These elements create a tension between tradition and modernity, between Vitebsk and Paris again, the rural and the urban. And it echoes, as we can guess, Fiddler on the Roof, a musical based on Tevye and his daughters, or Tevye the Dairyman, and other tales by Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem. On the right side is the painting Over Vitebsk. It belongs to a large series of works that the artist began after his return to his hometown in June 1914, which take as their subject an oversized, elderly beggar floating above the rooftops of Vitebsk during the winter. The painting plays on the Yiddish expression for a beggar moving from door to door, that is, geht über die Häuser, which means he walks over the houses. This whimsical turn of phrase allowed Chagall to transform an otherwise naturalistically rendered scene of Vitebsk in winter through the addition of a strange airborne character with a sack on his back, whose presence imbues the composition with a dreamlike otherworldliness. Next slide, please. Thank you. Here you have also, again, the expression, very powerful expression of color in Chagall's early paintings depicting traditional Jewish life, and particularly masculine characters. In his autobiography, he speaks about his uncle Yehuda, whom you can find here on the painting. And he says, Uncle Yehuda always lies on the oven. He doesn't even go to the prayer house. He prays at home at the window. He mumbles something quietly, and the yellow color slides down his face to the window molding, flows outside and spreads over the dome of the church. He looks like a wooden house with a transparent roof. I can paint him quickly. This quote, by the way, and all the other ones in English are taken from Benjamin Arshav's translation of Eygens, dating from his book published in 2004. Now, Chagall didn't feel very comfortable in his family. In fact, he needed to leave this world in order to free himself from its folklore and traditions and to live as an artist who makes his own way in the world. And in Eygens, there are a couple of very interesting anecdotes about his early years when he started painting in the house and how he made his way into an art school. Next slide, please. Here is the red Jew. I won't comment this one, except to say that it's part of that series where he depicts many Jewish men in traditional Jewish life in Vitebsk with his powerful colors. And later on, he said, in our life, there is a single color, as on an artist's palette, which provides the meaning of life and art. It is the color of love. It's a beautiful quote because he was fondly attached to Vitebsk until his later years, as we will see. Next one, please. So this is interesting. What about his calling? When did Chagall first realize that he was an artist, that he had a vocation? In his family, we must say that the fact that he wanted to become an artist was perceived as a total disaster. He was actually a lost cause. His mother was very disappointed since she had other plans for him. She wanted him to become a clerk or a bookkeeper, someone who can make a living. At home, he paints, and one day, one of his friends blurts out upon seeing one of his drawings, yeah, we'll keep on that one, please. And he comes and says, hey, listen, you are a real khudozhnik. Khudozhnik being a Russian word that was part of Yiddish at the time. And here you have two quotes about Chagall being a khudozhnik from the original text. So I'll continue in English. So Chagall responds, what does it mean, khudozhnik? Who khudozhnik? Could I really be such? He left and didn't answer. And I remember that somewhere in the city of Vitebsk, I had really seen a big sign as on storefronts that said, School of Painting and Drawing of the Khudozhnik Pen. And I thought, my destiny is set. I just have to go there and finish that school and I'll be a khudozhnik. And I shall forever part from my mother's dreams about a future of a store clerk, an accountant, or at best, a photographer with a future. So this is when he met Pen, his professor in Vitebsk. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. His mother brings him to Pen. She was pretty convinced that maybe he didn't have a real vocation, and she actually probably wanted him to say to Chagall that he didn't have a real talent. But what happens is actually the opposite. And Pen will be surprised by Chagall's intensity, by his talent, by the way he uses color. And also, so he admits him in his school. And Chagall, right from the beginning, is very different from the other students because he does some drawings with shining colors. Later on, he would say, color is all. When color is right, form is right. Color is everything. Color is vibration, like music. Everything is a vibration. On the right, you have a portrait of the young Marc Chagall by Yuri Pen, dating from 1915. Now, when you look at Chagall's paintings, you can hear a melody, let's say a klezmer melody. First, because there are many violinists in his artworks, violin being a major instrument in klezmer music, but also the colors speak by themselves. Looking at the colors, looking at the characters over which are sometimes superposed Yiddish or Hebrew words, you have music. In Chagall's paintings, as well as on his stained glass windows, color and music are brilliantly orchestrated. And in a way, we could say that painting offered him a nostalgic retreat into childhood. So this strong connection between color and music is very important, I think, and it was actually the title of an important exhibition on Chagall that took place at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts in 2007. We launched a translation of Chagall's autobiography. Next slide, please. You have it illustrated in other paintings, and in particular in these two ones that I find very beautiful. So you have here two images of lovers, which is a recurrent theme of Chagall's work. In these paintings, you can feel the musicality embedded in the weightless characters, the fluidity that characterizes their movement, and the subtle use of color. Characters flying over Vitebsk or wherever symbolized also, it's important to note this, it also symbolized freedom for Chagall at a time when, as a Jew in Russia, he couldn't even leave town without a permit. When the revolution gave Jews citizenship for the first time, along with a measure of authority, he was made commissar for art in Vitebsk and threw himself into the job. So now we will move to the next image, please. Thank you. Here comes on stage Benjamin Fondan, or Benjamin Fondoianu. He was a Romanian and French poet and existential philosopher who was also well known for his work in film and theater. Fondan was born in 1898, so just 1 year after Chagall, and he died in 1994 in Auschwitz. Basically, he and Chagall had a very similar background in Eastern Europe, and both men were brilliant minds of their times. They were two Jews who became assimilated to French modernist culture and who did a remarkable artistic work that distinguished them from their contemporaries. In 1934, Fondane published an essay on Brancusi, followed by a second on Chagall in a publication called The Cahiers Juifs de Paris. In this essay, Fondane identifies the painter as one of the great artists whose work defies the usual aesthetic categories. Like Brancusi, whose art doesn't really belong to his time, nor to his nation or to his century, Chagall allows himself the privilege to be atemporal while painting angels, scenes of folklore, and weightless or flying characters. On the one hand, describing Brancusi's art as an act of protest, an act of violence, whose clarity results from an extraordinary richness of obscurity. Fondane is fascinated, on the other hand, by Chagall's ability to produce an eclectic body of works where diverse influences merge together while expressing a profound sense of humor. Moreover, the poet-philosopher is attracted by the painter's capacity to elude the usual categories of national identity. In one of his most famous quotes about Chagall, he says, "So, Chagall doesn't have a passport, and that doesn't displease me at all. Isn't the artist even more Jewish in this sense? I would like a bit more often artists without any kind of passport." In his paintings, Chagall abolishes the frontiers between fiction and reality. He presents a utopian image as if it were a real fact, such as the grandfather on the roof eating carrots in his autobiography, for example. The fantastic motives of his paintings are not simply products of the imagination. He uses simultaneously two modes of expression. That is, that he comments on his paintings and paints legends, like the colorful Jews that we've seen before, or his uncles. Thus, he creates a saga narrative that allows the forms to unfold with freedom. His paintings, while focusing on the life of objects, reflect a poetic and plastic illumination that contributes to develop a pure oneirism where his bestiary occupies a major place. In what Fondane calls Chagall's Yiddish paradise, the artist transforms a lugubrious despair into a magical landscape which evokes mysticism and the merging of religions. Adding to the weightless characters, the words themselves seem to fly. They emanate from a prolific imaginary and break the syntactic rules. So now I'm referring more to his text in Eygens. These elements are deeply rooted in an Eastern European landscape that is very familiar to Fondane, for he grew up in the same kind of environment. Therefore, Chagall's world appears as a paradisiac space who lacks the emptiness and void so characteristic of human life, that stand at the core of Fondane's existential philosophy. For this reason, he qualifies him as an artist that emerges before the right and wrong, that is, before any kind of morality. It is a utopian world that magnifies reality. If Chagall appears to Fondane as a great painter, one of the greatest painters of our time, as he writes, his approach creates a sense of despair. So Fondane writes, Yet there are many paradises on earth. The Hebrew paradise, which is extremely violent, the Christian paradise, infinitely somber and subversive, but also a Yiddish paradise, very tender and painful, enthusiastic and very funny. It is a paradise of poverty, garlic, and pogroms, a bric-a-brac trade where one prays to a very ancient god. That is a paradise in which Chagall is hand in hand with I.L. Peretz, Sholem Aleichem, and Mendele Mochers for him, who, for those of you who don't know, are the three founding fathers of Yiddish literature, modern Yiddish literature. So, in other words, Fondant sees it quite well. Chagall's Yiddish paradise stands at the core of his artistic gesture. He has one foot in the modern world and the other in the Shtetl. This creative tension between the two worlds stands at the very heart of his creation. Now we will move to the next slide. There we go. So this is a very interesting autoportrait. This is an image from Mein Leben, Chagall's first tentative to publish an autobiographical work. He did this during his stay in Berlin, and it was composed only of autoportraits. There was no text. According to Benjamin Harshav, a part of Eygens, so I'm still referring to Chagall's original autobiography in Yiddish, a part of it was destined to be published in the book, but that finally did not happen, and we're not quite sure about the reason why it didn't happen. Probably that the text was not finished at that point. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there it is. Eygens, Chagall's autobiography. When I was working in the YIVO archives at the end of 2015, I was working on two Yiddish women poets, Katia Molodowski and Rachel Korn, and it is really because I was not planning to work on Chagall, but there was a beautiful event entitled Highlights of the Treasures of the YIVO archives. There you can see some original manuscripts from different kind of writers. There were also the audio archives as well, and so on. And then I saw the tapescript. It's called tapescript because he typed it. Chagall's first draft of his autobiography, all written in Yiddish. And so, like I said, my first encounter of Chagall's autobiography was through the French text entitled Ma vie, my life in French, which was published in 1931, and inside the book it was written that it was translated from Russian. Then I was kind of confused, and I was so amazed actually to discover that Chagall had written his autobiography in Yiddish that I thought, well, maybe it deserves our attention. Maybe there should be another translation. So I did a couple of inquiries with the archivist at YIVO, and while comparing the first pages of the Yiddish text and the last ones with the French publication dating from 1931, which was reprinted many times later on, you could tell that there were some differences only in the first and in the last pages. First, Chagall was expressing it was very passionate about Russia in the last pages, Mein Russland, Mein Russland. And in the French text, you wouldn't find this. It was not as much expressive as in the Yiddish. Also, there were many small changes, and then I thought, okay, so I think I'm going to take a look at this, and maybe we should retranslate it. And it turned out to be a wonderful adventure because Then I realized that I knew almost nothing about Chagall's autobiography or his voice, because his voice had been totally lost in the 1931 version. So anyhow, to make a long story short, his original autobiography was written in 1922-23 when he was 35 years old. I'm telling this again. So he was quite young. We don't have a second autobiography from Chagall. And since he has had a long life, he died at almost 98, we would have needed another one, but this didn't happen. So the only document that we have from him is this one. Eygens was published in a literary journal from New York entitled Die Tsukunft. Some of you might be familiar with it, with a beautiful imagery in the 1920s. You can see the influence of Expressionism, of the avant-garde movements, and on the different covers of the journals, like in this case, from June 1925. So Chagall's autobiography was published in several issues of Die Tsukunft. And in a vibrant but sometimes rough language, the artist tells of his life, from his birth in Vitebsk to his return to his hometown in 1922, after having traveled to St. Petersburg, Paris, and Moscow. Now, why translating Chagall, why were we interested in translating Chagall's autobiography in 2017? So first of all, our main goal was to render the authenticity of Chagall's voice. Like I said, the first edition of the autobiography was a book in French language edition. And actually, there's a whole story behind that manuscript, but what we know, based on Benjamin Arshav's research in the YIVO archives, is that there was probably a Russian version that was lost at some point, maybe a second Russian version, but all we know for sure is that the Yiddish version was Chagall's autobiography, and also that the French text was a kind of reconstruction that was probably, that, you know, it came at a very important period in Chagall's life, and it contributed to promote his career as an important artist of the avant-garde in Paris at the time. So why translate it in 2017? Also because the French had been standardized, and what does that mean specifically is that there were many references to religion, life in the Shtetl, and sexuality that had been removed or transformed in the text from 1931. Another important thing to say is that all the other versions, so the English version, the Russian version, and the Hebrew version that are the most popular, derive from the French. So if you are an English-speaking reader, an English reader, and that you don't have Benjamin Arshav's translation of the original, you probably have a translation of what has been a reconstruction of Chagall's life. And the title also gives you a good idea of the transformation of the text in French. Eygens signifies, it means in Yiddish, from myself. It's not about a person's life, which is more factual based on different kind of events. It's really his own inner space. And this is why I wanted the translator to be in French, mon univers, my own world, actually. And what's interesting also is that there is a kind of connection between the paintings and the text, because the way that Chagall abolishes the perspective is kind of oneiric sceneries, which is a recurrent motive in his paintings. You find it also in the autobiography. And then I will give you a couple of examples now about some differences that we found, differences between the original Yiddish and the, I would say, recomposed French version. Okay, we can move to the next slide, please. Okay. So I mentioned Benjamin Arshav in his imposing study entitled Marc Chagall and His Time, a narrative documentary. He underlines the fact that a long-lost Russian version of the autobiography would have existed. And this to say that in all likelihood, our translation is the second, probably the second, to have been realized from the Yiddish original text. While achieving this translation, we encountered a few challenges. The first has to do with the Gallicization of the text. It had an impact on the attenuation, if not censorship, of the painter's Jewish identity and his milieu. To give you a few examples of a transformation of a foreign writer, the foreign writer that Chagall was, into a French writer through literary translation, you have, for example, Dein Eyskele. Dein Eyskele, referring to his grandfather's house. Eyskele means a small house, a typical small town house. It becomes, in the French text, as ses appartements, so as apartments, meaning Parisian apartments. And Parisian apartments look like this, you know, the Haussmannian style in Paris. So it gives you an idea of, there's a huge difference between the two. Of course, a small house in a Shtetl and an apartment in Paris. The next one, please. Next one. Okay, that one is also very interesting. At a certain point, Chagall mentions the presence of der baal-hagole, which means in English a carter, the person. And in the French text, it becomes the fiacre, a word referring not to a person, but to a horse-drawn urban vehicle, but also it's really not the same setting or the same social standards that you can find behind that word. And we will go to the next slide because I want to introduce you to La Ruche. This is where Chagall went to live in Paris. La Ruche was the Montparnasse of the artists, and this is where he had his studio as well as many other artists of that period. He has met Picasso, Modigliani, many others in Paris, and they were all living more or less in Montparnasse. You have also on the right a beautiful photo of Chagall and Picasso. This is not from the same period, though it's from a later period, and they were probably in the south of France at that time. You can also see a group of artists in the other photo, just under the previous one. So Chagall was participated to the Salon des Indépendants in 1910, which was a major avant-garde exhibition. He was really involved into this vibrant milieu of Cubism, Fauvism. He has met also with Glazes, Delaunay, Metzinger, Léger, writers such as Blaise Cendrars, Guillaume Apollinaire, Valentine de Saint-Point also, and Ricciotto Canudo. And he felt so good there in Paris that he would say, Paris is, to me, is a second Vitebsk. And now I would like to give you a last example of how how should we call it, an adaptation of his autobiography in French, a passage that was simply erased from the text. And it takes place at the Ruche, at La Ruche. Next slide, please. There you go. So at some point, so I was kind of amazed in the Yiddish text to find this, this sentence at some point that I couldn't find in the French from entitled Ma vie. Mir is leib das, I can see because my screen is hidden right now. Okay, mir is Leben das Fransoziche Blut. In other words, Chagall was referring to the lady who was cleaning his studio, and there he was saying that what came in English as, I loved French blood while gnawing at French painting, trying to overcome it. I wanted to savor the taste of a French body. Then you take a look to the French version. It's not there. It was totally erased. And in French, we have l'envie me prit de goûter à la chair française. So all these references to eroticism, there are many about Jewish, well, mostly religion at the shul in Vitebsk, tended to make of Chagall, who was an immigrant in Paris, a French writer. And this is not unusual in France. In terms of literary translation, until the late 1990s, foreign writers used to be translated in a way that would erase the identity markers such as ethnicity, and also in the case of Chagall's Eygens, it was also a question of anti-Semitism raising at the time, probably. And the fact that a Jew wants to taste French blood, to have an affair with a French woman, was considered kind of a scandalous, as a taboo at the time. We will move to the next slide. And there you have another beautiful painting from Chagall about Paris, Paris through my window, with different elements here. And now the Haussmannian buildings in the Seine have replaced the small town buildings and the Divina in Vitebsk. I find it very interesting to quote Picasso about Chagall. Picasso once said, when Matisse dies, Chagall will be the only painter left who understands what color is. And interestingly, he lived a longer life than Picasso and Matisse. And finally, we have on the next slide, on the left, the book dating from 1931, Chagall, Ma vie. Benjamin Arshav's, so this was the first tentative to render Chagall's authentic voice in English in 2004 in his translation with his wife Barbara of Chagall's Eygens, and it's on in a big book entitled Chagall, Marc Chagall and His Times. And on the right side, you can see, so this is the translation that I did with Pierre Anctil of Eygens in French, and that was published in 2017. And actually, I'm very happy to give this talk tonight because I can share this with you. Tonight, there was supposed to be a very interesting event at the Musée d'Art et d'Histoire du Judaïsme, Museum of Art and History of Judaism in Paris. There was, it was supposed to be a lecture of passages of Chagall's autobiography in our translation. And so we were supposed to be there, but for reasons you already know, the event has been canceled, and as well as my trip. But I'm very happy to still have Chagall on my mind tonight and to share this with you. So in conclusion, I would say that Chagall belongs to the first generation of Russian Jews who entered at lightning speed into modernity and could explore freely their individual creativity. His work and autobiography bear the signs of a fast transition from Orthodox Judaism to new forms of social and cultural modes of living and acceptance. It reflects both a deconstruction and a recomposition of the culture of the Shtetl and of the Russian Jewish experience beyond its traditional boundaries. Despite conditions of extreme hardship, it represents an exceptional contribution to 20th century Western art. As an artist, he was a product of both modernist Paris and the Shtetl, a hybrid of the urban and the rural, of the new and the old. And although Chagall became cosmopolitan, he always remained later in his life, in his inner thoughts, I would say a Shtetl boy. The colors and the paintings last. For him, although the Yiddish world in Eastern Europe has disappeared, what we call nowadays the Yiddish land. And actually his work defies that. The flame illuminating his colors and his paintings last forever, as well as his Yiddish paradise. In this sense, he really transcends all the boundaries, not only those of nationality, language, modernity, and artistic movements, but also the frontiers of death. As an artist, his work defies the limitations of human life, and this is still true today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantal, for your wonderful talk. I think everybody will join me in, I don't know why I'm seeing only myself. I think everybody will join me in thanking Chantal for a wonderful, wonderful talk, so visually stunning. And also, I think you were able to cover a lot of ground, from the previous generation of the French translation to your and Pierre Anquetil's contribution. I have to say it was wonderful to see, I don't know if anybody else noticed that, the placement of the two French translations facing each other, Ma vie and mon univers. I don't know if that was a coincidence, but it seems
it actually is.
That was an interesting detail that I personally noticed. So I'll just invite everybody at this moment. You can share your questions to Chantal in the chat function. I'll be monitoring those, or you can raise your hand. And I do see there is a hand, Miriam Isaacs will get to your question shortly. If I may, I just wanted to start with a quick question that I had for you, Chantal, and a couple of questions that an enthusiastic participant shared before the talk, before we get to Miriam's questions and then everybody else who raises their hand. So what I noticed is that you gave a very interesting reflections on Chagall by Benjamin Fontaine, for instance. And I was wondering, obviously Fontaine comes from this French-speaking intellectual milieu. I was wondering if the work of Giel Aronson, the Yiddish, the Polish Yiddish language critic of the Montparnasse artists, is, you know, is playing any part in your work. So Giel Aronson wrote, you know, his magnum opus about the Bohemian artists of Montparnasse, the book which, to my knowledge, has not been translated into English yet. I'm not sure. Maybe somebody would correct me. But yes, I'm wondering, you know, if in your work he, you know, he plays any part, because obviously, you know, Giel Aronson had a lot to say about Chagall specifically. And I guess I'll just read, you know, the other questions, and you can address, you know, you can address my question last, or it doesn't matter. The questions that we got before were regarding Chagall's motivation for use of color and fantastic imagery in his painting. And, you know, you spoke so brilliantly and at length about Chagall's use of color. So what motivated Chagall with his paintings and the use of color and fantastic imagery? And then a question which maybe, you know, is along the same lines of my question of Chagall's close relationship with other artists in Paris, and particularly Picasso. Yeah, so we'll start with those and then.
Yeah, these are very good questions. Thank you. First of all, I don't know much about the work of the intellectual you mentioned, probably because he hasn't been translated. I'm not aware that his book were translated into English or French. But I'd be happy to know more about him. Many people wrote about the Montparnasse artists. There's lots of books available in French, of course, but it's always interesting to discover a contribution from someone who was not part of that culture, of that milieu, and I'd be happy to know more about him. Yes. And so about his engagement in the Parisian artistic community, what I could say is that, yeah, I said a few words about it. So he was frequently meeting with Picasso, with the other painters, but and writers as well. There's a lot of, I mean, Guillaume Apollinaire, Blaise Cendrars wrote about Chagall's work also. And of course, this was impossible to cover it all in in such a short talk, actually. But what's important to say is that he was apart from all those people. You know, he was friends with people who sharing idea with painters of from different movements like Cubism, Fauvism, for example, but he always preferred to be considered separately from the other artists. And by the way, what's very interesting is that it was the same thing for Benjamin Fontaine. At some point, it was called a surrealist writer in his early beginnings, and later on, he preferred to move to other directions. And you know, they both had a very personal their own world and a very personal contribution that makes them unique in this world. So a vibrant community of artists, yes, with also another important thing to mention, many émigrés. And don't forget that in France, being an immigrant in Paris, so in the 1930s, it's not the same thing as being in New York, for example. The social parameters are different. You're part of the République des Lettres, and you know, the République simply with its social values, boundaries, and everybody has to adapt to a French identity at some point. Also, religion and ethnicity are private. It's not something that you should express publicly. So that's what I would say in general about Chagall, and then of course Matisse, for example, the use of colors by the way Matisse uses colors in his painting is quite remarkable, but Chagall and the way Chagall deconstructs the perspectives, and also the fact that he had such a long life and he painted, and he was also a decorator, and he also did these stained glass windows, so beautiful artworks that you can find in many cities in the world, especially, I'm thinking especially about those at the Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, which are so beautiful. And, you know, there's a whole imagery, and it's, yeah, it's a wonderful world in which a wonderful work, a wonderful oeuvre in which color plays a very important role. And not that many artists who were part of Montparnasse became so famous in different parts of the world. Or they might have been, but their own journey might not have been so, you know, so deeply immersed by, of course, by diaspora. But of course, that's something that is deeply, that goes with Jewish culture, of course, yeah, culture of the diaspora. And in this sense, there's a very interesting tension in Chagall's work and in his life from the diaspora, from the Shtetl, to cosmopolitanism, as defined in the Western world.
Chantal, if I could interrupt you for a second, Miriam Eygens has a question for you, and she has to leave soon, so I'll unmute her and we'll let her pose the question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Hello, Miriam.
D'abord, je te remercie. Thank you so much. Also for beginning in Yiddish, which is lovely. I never realized that Chagall had a good sense of humor, but in that quote that was taken out, not only was he, I think, pushing the boundaries of carnal love, but also the blood libel story in France. So that was a very bold sentence or two for him to write. But I wanted to let everybody know that here in Washington, in the National Gallery of Art, there's a huge mural that I actually sort of found by accident by taking a shortcut through the sculpture garden of refugees, of himself and refugees. And it was something that he made for a family in Georgetown who had helped him get out of France. And they had it in their garden for a long time, and then they donated it to the National Gallery. And I took photos of it. I can send them to you if you like, if I can find them. But it's really quite a special work. So anyway, thank you so much. That's
Thank you. I'd be glad to see a photo of that artwork.
Yes, it has King David in the middle playing a harp, but then off in the corner, a sort of huddled bunch of refugees kind of waiting by the side. So it's very lyrical and
Do you
quite
know if it's considered part of his religious artworks? Because there's a whole series of Chagall that is really considered as religious.
This is a fusion of religion and music.
As often is the case, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. While you were speaking, Chantal, there's a lot of praise for the talk, for the wonderful talk that you gave. We also got another question by Joseph Carey, who's asking, did Chagall write his original text in Yiddish or in Russian?
So just like I explained, he wrote it in Yiddish in 1922-23. And it's kind of a hidden story because if you want to know about the whole story, you have to read Benjamin Arshav's introduction to Chagall, the book that I just mentioned before, because he did the whole research with the archivist. So there was probably a Russian version that came after the Yiddish one. Maybe it was lost, maybe it was recomposed with a writer and then lost again. So we don't know about it. So it's all about, we don't have any proofs of that, okay? And what is interesting is that in France, Chagall is considered as a French-Russian artist. And in his autobiography that was published in a book form in 1931 under the title Ma Vie, it is written in the first pages that it was translated from Russian. So that's very interesting. But what's also interesting when you read Arshat, what's also interesting to learn is that she, Bertha, aka Bella Chagall, did it with her daughter's Russian professor. Okay. Sorry, French professor, of course. So, so you know, there's a lot of stories going on, but for sure, what we know is that the Yiddish version was the original, and it was published in Die Tsukunft in 1925.
Great. So I just, I did send a message to everybody in the chat that if you'd like, you can type up your question. You can email it to Sharon or myself, or, you know, just raise your hand and we should be able to unmute you. We did get a comment from Paula S. Thanks for this enlightening talk. It puts Chagall's identity into a more Yiddish context than the later French-Russian attribution. I think that's a wonderful remark. Yeah, Esther Simpson, thanked you for the talk. Do we have any questions at this time? I think we'll take our last round of questions.
I see a question now about
oh yes,
there's a copy of the Yiddish text of Eygens at the Yiddish Book Center. Probably, but you can find it in the archives at YIVO, for example. So, or everywhere where you can find microfilms of the literary journal, Die Tsukunft, the future in English.
Betty Lowenstein, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, would like to know more about his daily life, his two wives and who were his muses. So that was the question.
Yeah, I can. Okay, I know more about Bertha, Bella Chagall, because she died in the early 1940s, and Chagall was desperate at the time to lose his wife, actually she was very important. They had a daughter together first, and he speaks about the daughter just a bit in the Yiddish text and more in the reconstruction in French. And what's interesting to note, I was mentioning in my presentation, not the distortion, but the way Jewish identity was reconstructed in French through literary translation. For example, Bella Chagall, so Bella sounds Latin, Italian maybe, but it was not her original name. Her original name was Bertha, which is slightly different, right? And what's important to note is that she published, she also published some text in Yiddish, and that for Chagall, she was always very important because he continued to do many paintings inspired by her figure and her presence in his life when they were together. But so that's what I can say. I know less about the second wife, because also the second wife is not included in the autobiography, and my focus as a scholar here was really the first autobiography.
Mm-hmm. We also got into more questions from Emmanuel Catan and Esther Ryder. So the first question from Emmanuel is, I was wondering whether Chagall elaborated on artists who most influenced him in his autobiography. And maybe I'll read the second question to you as well from Esther Ryder. Could you say something about the circus illustrations? And I also think that I heard that Chagall participated in doing art for the Yiddish children's communes in the early 1920s. Do you know where?
That I'm not sure exactly. But it was a very important period for Chagall doing, in specifically about is engaged in Jewish theater in Moscow, where we did a lot of murals. And I'm sorry, can you hear me? Because I received this message that I have an unstable connection right now.
I can hear you, but I didn't see you just before now. Now I can see you and hear you.
Okay. Okay. Did you hear what I said?
Mm-hmm. But you can repeat again, I guess.
So I was I don't know exactly. Okay. His engagement with or his involvement with Yiddish children's communities in the early 1920s. I don't know much because he didn't mention it as autobiography. Appeared in different communities. The teacher, for example, specifically about the Jewish theater of Moscow, where costumes, he had fights with Shavsky at the time. That's another story. We won't get into this right now in the Yiddish theater. But so that's about it. And about his influences, he's not that clear about it. He mostly, what he says mostly is that he was very different. So he doesn't really relies on one master. Of course, there was pen, and before pen, usually pen, there was Bakst. But then he always had to leave and find his way, his voice, his personal mode of expression as a painter, was as he saw, and the other ones that he couldn't really rely on specific mentor for a long time. So that's what I would say.
Thank you. I mean, we also received a couple more questions. There was a question about the extent of anti-Semitism that Marc Chagall experienced prior to leaving Russia. I know that, that wasn't the focus of Chantal's talk, but, still a question that we had.
Yeah, well, it's important to know that at this time, so late 1900s, in Eastern Europe, there were many pogroms. Jews were often marginalized, and there were many acts of violence. We know that 1, 2, 3 generations before the Holocaust, there were many pogroms. And some scholars who did research on Holocaust, in Holocaust studies, in the field of Holocaust studies, remarked that it comes back every 2 generations in Eastern Europe. So this is something that was very palpable, but in a small town like Vitebsk, where the Jewish community was very strong, where it was there was a large number of Jews, 60% of the whole town. I mean, they were sometimes less such a say, although it depends. Right? I don't have any information about that. But what we that anti-Semitism is in part of the Russian state were kind of the norm, like sometimes latent anti-Semitism and sometimes expressed violently. So Chagall certainly faced anti-Semitism and he encountered it during his life in many ways, but in biography, he doesn't position himself as a Jew who suffered from anti-Semitism, although we all know that he was exposed to it, of course. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chantal. I think we're gonna wrap up the lecture. If you do have more questions for Chantal, please reach out to Sharon Power, poweryiddish@gmail.com. You should have received her email in your registration when you were registering for the lecture. I think, you know, I'm joined by a lot of people expressing their gratitude for having learned a lot from you, Chantal, and on behalf of the Committee for Yiddish and the Workmen's Circle in Toronto, thank you. Schönen Dank.
Schönen Dank.
Und schönen Dank allemen. Thank you for participating in this lecture today. And I hope you have the rest, the nice rest of your evening.
Yes, thank you, everyone. This is Sharon. Thanks for your patience as we let you all in. It was a wonderful lecture. Thank you. Schönen Dank.
Thank you, Sharon, as well, for being a wonderful co-host and making this possible for us.
Fargenigen. Fargenigen.
So thank you all. And thank you, Sharon and Anastasia in particular, and the the Yiddish Committee of the Greater Toronto Area, the Workmen's Circle, and the Jewish Federation of Toronto. I was very happy to share this with you tonight.
Good evening, everybody. Yeah, so see you soon at our next lectures.